So now it's becoming increasingly likely at this point that we're going to see our first tropical cyclone develop somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico within the next few days. We now have a high 70% chance from the National Hurricane Center of this disturbance developing into a tropical cyclone. And we also have this other disturbance we're going to take a look at as well, which currently has a low 30% chance, but I wouldn't be surprised if that chance rises as we approach more into the future once the computer models get a little bit more confidence with that forecast. But first, let me focus on this disturbance. Let me first show you guys the water vapor imagery. And taking a look at this invest, we clearly see that there is plenty of convective activity going on, but there isn't really an organized center of circulation where all the convective activity is rotating around, where we pretty much see the convection very scattered. And you could probably tell by where the clouds are moving that the upper level winds right over the Yucatan Peninsula as well as the southern Gulf of Mexico are coming from the southwest, as there is an upper level low that's located right around the Texas region that is expected to move out, and there is actually an upper level high that's located just to the south of this convective activity. And as this moves northward, it's going to create more of a conducive environment where the wind shear will wind down for this to potentially intensify, most likely intensify into a tropical storm. But there's still questions that remain, such as the exact trajectory of this storm system, because it's going to be very difficult to pinpoint where exactly the center of circulation is. But we clearly see as of right now it's fairly disorganized, but this convective activity, once it moves northward, it's of course going to be amplified by the very warm Gulf of Mexico water, and we're going to see more organization within the next few days. But for the Yucatan Peninsula as well as portions of Guatemala and Belize, you need to watch out for heavy rainfall over the next few days, and this rainfall is expected to move northward up towards the northern coasts of Mexico as well as Texas in the very near future, regardless of this if this develops into a tropical storm or not. When it comes to what the most reliable computer models are forecasting, it seems like they're in fairly good agreement as of right now regarding the exact strength of this storm system, where it is expected to develop into a tropical storm, but it doesn't expect much more than maybe a mid-range tropical storm. We see that by the time we approach a Wednesday time frame, this storm system is expected to hover around the upper 990s when it comes to its millibar pressure, which might be associated with maybe a 60 mile per hour tropical storm. But what's interesting about this storm system is that it's very large, as you could see. So even if the center of circulation moves well to the south of the United States-Mexico border, Texas will still most likely receive very heavy impacts, and it's only going to be amplified by the fact that there is a strong pressure gradient between this big ridge that's located over the east coast, which is expected to bring record high temperatures in many areas along the eastern half of the United States. But this big ridge is pretty much interacting with this low pressure system, creating sort of a strong pressure gradient and a strong southeasterly flow. So we're going to see a large area of wind that's just going to move over the very warm convective areas of the Gulf of Mexico to allow this storm system on northeastern side to be quite elongated and bring a heavy amount of rainfall over a very long duration, which is exactly what's happening with the GFS models case, where we see very heavy rainfall right up along the Texas coast. And as this is very concerning, as I'll say that this could potentially be an extreme and life-threatening flooding threat, river flooding threat for much of the Texas coast. So places like Houston, Corpus Christi, and in the areas even further westward than that, you need to be aware of a high risk of flooding associated with this storm system. And like I said, it doesn't need to develop into a tropical storm. You likely will experience very heavy rain out of this. Now, there are still questions regarding its trajectory, but in my opinion, I'm not sure if it even matters that much, because like I said, this storm is very large. So even if you're hundreds of miles away from the center, you're still going to receive impacts. But what's interesting is that the computer models are having a little bit of a difficulty regarding where exactly a center of circulation will form, as this typically happens in a gyre-like environment during the early part of the hurricane season, where there's just a very large area of convective activity. So there's multiple areas where, let's say, a low-level center could develop where there's a bit more thunderstorm activity. And since the area of convective activity is so large, there's just a large area that's trying to compete for a limited amount of energy. So it's going to be very interesting to see where exactly the center of circulation develops, as that's certainly keeping the uncertainty relatively high when it comes to exactly where it'll make landfall. Most likely, it'll, of course, be anywhere between Mexico and potentially as far north as Texas, but that's a pretty large gap when it comes to where exactly you could see a landfall. In the GFS models case, we see that a low-level center does develop, but we sort of see two low-level centers develop. We see one that develops a little bit closer to the Texas coast, and another one that's a little bit further southward and doesn't have as much convective activity surrounding it, but that still is expected to become the main low-level center in the GFS model scenario. But there still could easily be that possibility that the GFS model could shift its forecast where it's focusing more of its energy or its vorticity towards this low-level center, and we see a landfall in Texas. So there's still uncertainty regarding the forecast. We're going to need to wait a couple days, see how the thunder shower activity moves through the Gulf of Mexico, because that'll play a big determinant in where exactly the center of circulation will form. And once the center of circulation forms anywhere in the Gulf of Mexico, that's when we could make definitely a much more confident forecast regarding where exactly it'll make landfall. Of course, this ridge will play a role as well. If this ridge ends up being a little bit stronger, then we should expect a track further southward towards the coast of Mexico. But if it's a little weaker, we could expect maybe a landfall towards Texas. But either way, like I said, you're going to experience extreme flood threat right up along the Texas coast, so you need to keep that in mind. Same goes for Mexico, regardless of where this makes landfall and regardless of whether this develops into a tropical storm or not. But like I said, the most likely, and like what the National Hurricane Center is stating, it's most likely to happen that we're going to see a tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico, as we see that there is plenty of convective activity. If we were to take a look at the wind shear isn't necessarily extremely strong, which should help this the convective activity really organize itself. And in terms of the possibility of maybe this strengthening into a hurricane, like some people might be suggesting, it seems like it's the computer models aren't leaning towards that direction, as there is going to be a decent amount of dry air that it's going to need to contend with, which I think will limit its chance of developing into much more than a mid-range tropical storm. We see that there's going to be quite a bit of dry air located right over the Texas area, as that should help make the storm somewhat asymmetrical. And of course, tropical cyclones don't like when they're a bit too asymmetrical, because you need convective activity on all sides of this storm system to really maximize the heat engine right around the center of circulation. So it seems like the dry air might be a little bit too much for this to handle. And while I did say the wind shear is just light enough for this to maybe strengthen into a tropical storm, there's still going to be a decent amount of wind shear associated with this. If we were to take a look at the wind shear anomaly over the next 5 days, we do see that it is expected to be a little bit lighter right over the Gulf of Mexico, so that should help. But if we were to take a look at this other map, we do see that the wind shear is a little bit stronger than usual, right? Especially right over the eastern Gulf of Mexico. The storm will be able to bypass it in this small area where the wind shear isn't as strong, but still there is a decent amount of wind shear that should help keep it below hurricane status, most likely, thankfully. So and another thing too is that this storm, like I said, it's very, very large, and with large systems and circulations like this, it's very difficult to create a small center of circulation that could really maximize its wind speed, because a lot of that vorticity is spread out over a very large area rather than focus in over a small center of circulation, where all that vorticity could really maximize the heat engine and really intensify the winds. So it seems like this storm is a little bit too strong for that to happen, and along with the other factors, it most likely will stay as a mid-range tropical storm or a low-range tropical storm. But like I said, the wind speed won't even matter that much, because a heavy rain threat will be the biggest threat with this storm system, and maybe some high surf and coastal flooding in localized areas right up along the coast of Texas and Mexico. And here's the exact amount of rainfall you should expect right up along the Texas coast, as this is very concerning. We do have areas like Galveston and Corpus Christi getting involved with anywhere between 7 to 10 inches of rain over the next 5 days, and this rainfall is expected to extend into the Houston area as well, and even as far inland as Austin and San Antonio. You could get involved with very heavy rainfall that's capable of bringing extreme flooding. So all throughout Texas, you need to be prepared, especially if you live in very flood-prone areas, for the possibility of extreme flooding, potentially some of the worst flooding you've seen in years in certain locations. So you definitely want to be aware of that, as there is also a high flash flood risk associated with this storm system thanks to thunder shower activity. So you want to be aware of that as we approach later during the week. I'll say Wednesday to Thursday, that's when you should expect the worst of the heavy rainfall right up throughout Texas as well as the Mexican coast. So now here's a quick look at this other disturbance we're taking a look at, because there is a possibility we could see another tropical storm landfall in the very near future. We have this disturbance right here, which doesn't look like much of anything. The convective activity is fairly light, and there really isn't much going on with this storm system as of right now. But if we were to take a look at the GFS model, the GFS model does show some interesting signs of development. We see that the millibar pressure drops down to around 1,008 millibars. We do see I wouldn't say an organized center of circulation, but we do certainly see a well-defined area of rotation with this storm system, which could indicate that this could develop into a tropical storm. And we do see this make landfall right in between Florida and Georgia, as in this scenario it could potentially be a tropical storm, maybe just below that category. It seems like it's fairly weak and it's fairly small, which wouldn't be much of a concern, but it still certainly raises a possibility of potentially seeing a tropical storm anywhere between Georgia, Florida, and who knows, maybe even as far north as South Carolina. So we're definitely going to need to pay close attention to this. This does bring some rainfall right over Florida and Georgia, so it's certainly something to keep in mind in the more long-term future. But if we were to take a look at the European model is definitely less aggressive with this storm system, as it does develop at least somewhat of a center of circulation, or at least some rotation associated with this area of convective activity. But you're going to see that it's much weaker than what the GFS model is currently forecasting. So if we were to take a look at that, you clearly see that that the storm system is just far weaker, and it just pretty much fizzles out thanks to the amount of dry air that's located just to the west of this storm system. So there's still a pretty high amount of uncertainty when we see both of the most reliable computer models completely disagree with each other. The GFS model wants to take borderline a tropical storm landfall anywhere between Georgia and Florida, while the European model just wants to fizzle this out, as there's going to be several factors that will, at least for now, make it difficult for this to develop into a tropical storm. Of course, the dry air is one of them. We do have this very strong ridge, and we do have some troughs moving through that left a decent amount of dry air right over the southeast, so that should hinder a lot of convective activity and create more of a sinking motion with, next to this storm system that would help suppress tropical cyclone development. So that's only one of the factors. Another factor is that the wind shear could be relatively strong the further westward it moves, and the reason why is because there is going to expect to be a strong upper level high that will be associated with what likely will become tropical storm Alberto, that will actually enhance the wind shear a little bit further to the east of where the upper level high is located. So if we were to take a look at that, we see that the wind shear is relatively strong. There's the upper level high I was talking about, and that should potentially help limit the chance of this tropical disturbance developing into a tropical storm with this much wind shear, which is definitely very interesting. We're going to need to see the position of this upper level high, but it seems like the wind shear right now, it's going to make it very difficult for this to develop into a tropical storm, but who knows? The forecast could change. We're going to need to see the position of this upper level high as well. Maybe it could be weaker, or maybe it could move a little bit further westward than expected, which could help limit the wind shear right over Florida. And as the storm continues ahead further westward. So we're gonna need to wait and see on that. And another thing too that's interesting is that this will develop off pretty much of an upper level low, so it could obtain some subtropical characteristics, and that's another reason why that it might be difficult for this to develop, because it's really gonna be developing right under an upper level low, which could make it a little bit difficult to develop a low level center in a way that'll be tropical enough for this to be categorized as a tropical storm. But there's still that certainty. There's still certainly that possibility this could develop into a subtropical storm. I won't rule that out, but I'll keep you guys updated once we get a little bit more confidence with what the computer models are stating with this storm system. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching, as I'll make sure to keep you guys updated over the next several days when it comes to the hurricane season. So make sure to stay tuned, and I hope you guys all enjoy the rest of the week.